We continue today our conversation on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom 50 years later. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, let's turn to another clip from Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech at the march in Washington on August 28, 1963.
In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds.
Gary Young, this issue of the insufficient funds, the emphasis on jobs, not just freedom, could you talk about that aspect of not only King's speech, but of the thrust of the march?
Yeah. I mean, because it's interesting that it is known as the I Have a Dream speech and, for example, not the bad check speech. That metaphor comes from a moment in Birmingham when a large number of young kids, some as young as 6, are in jail for protesting. And a segregationist judge raises the bail money, and the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, don't have the money. Via Harry Belafonte, Clarence Jones gets a call from Rockefeller, the New York governor, I think, at the time, Nelson Rockefeller. And he goes to his bank vault. And there's Clarence Jones, Rockefeller, bank functionary, and a security guard. He hands over a huge amount of cash, and he says, "You must sign this promissory note." And Clarence Jones says, "I don't have that money. We don't have that money." He says, "Look, you've got to sign it to take it out of the vault. Everything's going to be fine." Clarence Jones signs it. Takes the money down to Birmingham. The kids are bailed out. He comes back to New York. A messenger comes, and on the promissory note, it's stamped paid. And Clarence Jones gets to thinking, where there's a will, America could do this. America has the money. It has the resources. It's the most powerful country in the world. If America wanted to make this happen, if the political culture wanted to make this happen, it would happen. There are the means, there is not the will. And so he writes this refrain, which King sticks to very faithfully. What's interesting about that is that the dream segment, which I do love because I think that it's important to dream. I think it's important. King could have gotten up there and said, "I have a 10-point plan for how we get from here to somewhere else in, you know, the most reasonable manner." But he didn't. He stands in the middle of the most vile racism, and he dreams of a world where racism no longer exists. And I think it's very important for progressives to have those dreams, to keep in mind. We talk about immigration reform. Let's dream of a land with no borders, for example. And so I like that section. But it allows people to step out of the now and to get very airy-fairy about it. And what the cash check does, or the bad check, is it brings it back to brass tacks and says, look, we have to make good on the promise of this nation. And there is, when people ask, you know, it's one of the least interesting questions about a speech, I think, is, do you think his dreams have been realized? And I think the likelihood that King would come back, look at our jails, look at our schools, look at Congress and say, my work here was done, is very unlikely. That check is still a bad check, and it still needs to be, honored. And so in many ways, it brings those issues back to light. Black unemployment is still twice the rate of white unemployment, as it was in '63. The disparities in median income still very similar. Look around at Trayvon Martin or the Zimmerman case. Look at the attempt to gut the Civil Rights Act, and you can see the ways in which this moment and the victories of this moment are being shelled out and being gutted, and how the history of that moment is being rewritten, not as a victory against codified segregation, which it was, but as a victory against racism, as though racism is something of the past. Not a live, real thing, but a discrete historical moment that America has actually overcome, which clearly it hasn't. And in that nature, the speech is misunderstood as an artifact instead of what it is, which is a living, breathing document that still speaks to the realities of today.
Well, I'd like to ask Will Jones, the issue that you've raised in your book, that the March on Washington in 1963 was one of the culminating moments of the American left and of the issues of economic injustice being raised on a national scale. Could you talk about that and also the lessons for today of what a movement means in terms of addressing some of the issues that Gary Young raised?
Yeah, well, I guess picking up on Gary's comments, I think another thing that's important to remember about King's speech is that it was the last speech. And the New York Times coverage actually pointed this out the next day. It said, you know, it's ironic that King, who, as Gary pointed out, had actually suffered the most of all. He was the one who had been in jail, who had been beaten. He had been really in the trenches. He was the most optimistic and uplifting of the speeches. And as the New York Times pointed out, the other speakers really focused and concentrated on the struggle at hand, and they spoke in tough language, was the language of the New York Times. So I think we need to remember that by the time Martin Luther King came on stage, there had been 9 other speeches that were very specific over and over and over again, particularly, I would say, about the importance of economic justice. And I actually think it's possible that by the time Martin Luther King got on stage, he felt that the struggle in the South against legal segregation had actually been ignored a bit, that people had downplayed the significance of it. A lot of the speakers like Randolph, Roy Wilkins, Walter Reuther, they all said, well, it's important to deal with legal segregation, but if we don't deal with the jobs issue, none of that matters. And I think King might have actually felt that he had to bring the attention back to the importance of fighting segregation, fighting for voting rights in the South. And if anybody had sort of gotten caught up in King's speech and forgotten the specifics of the struggle, A. Philip Randolph came back right immediately and read the full list of demands, and then Bayard Rustin led everybody in a mass pledge to go home to their communities and uphold them. So I think we've often forgotten the economic issues that were really central to the march in hindsight, but at the time they were really unavoidable. So I think that's something that we need to remember as we remember this march, that it really was, and I think had a very profound effect on shifting the national conversation, even within the civil rights movement itself, toward a major focus on the connections between racial equality and economic justice. I think also as we remember this, we need to remember that it was a product of really over 2 decades of organizing, starting with the labor movement in the 1930s, gaining very important support from the women's movement, particularly black women's clubs, who had been really fighting on the front lines of fighting poverty in black communities since the 19th century. The importance of the movement that Martin Luther King led in the South in terms of sort of legitimizing mass protests, demonstrating the effectiveness of Gandhian nonviolence, and the way in which the march really brought those various strands of black radicalism, which I think the left really needs to claim as its own. I mean, it's really an indigenous American leftism that I think has been lost to many.
Will Jones, I mean, of course, after this march, you had Kennedy was assassinated in November, but then the Civil Rights Act was passed, the Voting Rights Act was passed. Where this fits in, especially Section 7, very quickly?
Well, a central demand of the march was to limit congressional representation in any state where citizens were deprived the right to vote. I think the important thrust of the march was actually not to make a moral statement about the superiority of racial integration or racial equality, but to call for strong federal programs aimed at upholding that ideal. And in the most recent Supreme Court case, we saw exactly that. We saw an affirmation of the validity of racial equality, but then a stepping back from the enforcement measures, which I think was really the issue in 1963, and I think it's the issue we face today.
Final comments, Gary Young, as we go out of this discussion about this day and what wasn't understood about August 28, 1963. Of course, the Life magazine cover after was not a picture of King, but a picture of the organizers, A. Philip Randolph, the great labor organizer, and Bayard Rustin.
I think two things are important. The first is to rescue this speech and this moment from those who would argue that this is just one more example of America's relentless move towards progress. Large numbers of people, the majority of Americans, in fact, did not want this march or this speech to happen. It was a mass act of dissidence, one that spoke to people around the world. I was born and raised in Britain. My parents are from Barbados. I knew about this speech as a young child and heard it at school in England at the age of 12 or 13. This is a world speech. And secondly, America's favorite speech. This is America's favorite speech alongside the Gettysburg Address, was delivered by a black man, a preacher who was calling for racial equality and who was assassinated for making those demands. That is, in a sense, is the achievement. The achievement is that through the forward march
5 seconds.
of the push for civil rights and racial equality in this country, this speech has been kind of forced into the mainstream and is now America's favorite speech.
We want to thank you.